Welcome to the National Women's Fitness Academy podcast. We're here to talk about women's health, female hormones, body image, and all things health and fitness.
Hello, girls, and welcome back to the Women's Fitness Academy's podcast. I'm your host, Siggy, one of the WFA's educators and a women's health and confidence coach. Today, I'm joined by the lovely Joanna. Again, for those who didn't listen to our first podcast, which would have been 2 years ago, I would highly recommend for you to go back and listen to it. And in today's podcast, we're actually going to be diving into helping you gain more insights, practical advice to help you break free from the cycle of suffering, rediscovering joy. And before we jump in, I want to introduce Joanna. So Joanna is a health practitioner. She's also a dedicated mother and a true advocate to the human experience. Now, having faced her own health challenges, Joanna understands the struggles of us women feeling tired, overwhelmed, frustrated, trapped in a cycle where it affects literally every aspect of our life. Now, she knows this because it actually took a toll on her, and she was dealing with a lot of pain, battling fatigue, taking time off work, navigating relationship strains, you name it, she's been through this. And this is why I wanted to bring her back on board to help you navigate what needs to be broken free in your life around whether it's weight gain, whether it's you entering your 40s, whether it's hot flashes, anxiety, brain fog, the whole fucking lot. Okay. So before I continue, Joanna, welcome back.
Thanks for having me. When you said it was 2 years, I was like, holy shit, it would be 2 years. But yeah, time sure does fly when you're having fun.
Yes, 100%. And you're having a lot of fun because for those who don't know, Joanna has moved to Mexico. And in the last 18 months, she's living the absolute dream over there. And I love this for you so much because, again, Mexico, as you mentioned before we started recording, how the weather is still consistent and warm even during winters. And for those who live in Melbourne, know how cold it can get during winter.
Even consistency, when we first moved here, we moved to Oaxaca City. I'm on the coast now, but we were in a city, and I reckon it took me 6 months to stop checking the weather every time I woke up. Like, that was my ritual in Melbourne. You wake up, make yourself a cuppa, you'd check the weather for the day, and then you'd figure out, what 2 outfits you were going to deal with that day. It took me 6 months to realize it was 26 every day.
It's so, I love it so much for you. And I'm sure a lot of our listeners who are nationally based in Australia, or even those who are internationally in warmer places, don't really have this issue that us Melbourne people do. And as you mentioned, like breaking that habit of constantly checking the weather, it's just like so unseen for you now.
Yeah, and things that we take for granted, like always leaving the house with a jacket. So apparently Toronto in Canada can be very similar, but a friend of mine who I met here, she's actually from northern New South Wales, southern Queensland, and she did a placement she lived in St Kilda for a while, and she said, she would leave the house and it would be sunny and warm and she'd just have a t-shirt, and then one day she was walking home in like the hail and she just was like, what even is this? Although I was having a chat with another friend of mine about the weather here. He's from Minneapolis, and so he's used to like really cold weather. He lives in Tassie now. But I was telling him, he's actually my fitness coach, and I was telling him the reasons why I wasn't working out and I had to do at the time with the extreme heat. So I was walking my dogs in the morning. I've got 2 big dogs and I walk them for about an hour in the morning. So it's not like I wasn't doing anything, but it would take me hours to stop sweating just from that walk because it was so hot. And I said to him, you've got to understand, because he was like, come on, I'm hearing a lot of excuses. I was like, got to understand. My friend's ceiling fan melted. And he was like, what? And I sent him a photo. So the blades of the ceiling fan must have had like a polymer blend in them. And it was so hot that they wilted, they drooped down. And I said to him, like I told you before we actually pressed record, for the first 2 months that we lived in this house, we didn't know that we hadn't turned on the hot water service because the water coming out of the cold tap was hot. So And my friend was like, that's not even a real place. That's not a real place. And I was like, it is, I assure you. So yeah, it's certainly, the weather is consistent, but when it's hot, it gets pretty hot here.
Speaking of hot, the main reason that I got you on today is for women who are entering their 40s, late 30s, who are starting to experience more of like that perimenopause phase of life, which is usually like the hot flushes. Some women experience the weight gain or the anxiety. How have you been able to overcome these challenges or address these issues in this part of the world that you're living in? Because again, as you mentioned, like the weather has been affecting you too.
So first of all, excellent segue. And secondly, I'm fortunate in that whilst I am 42, I don't really have any signs of perimenopause yet. So for me personally, it's not so much of an issue, but I do know that people who live in hot climates, it's tough when they're dealing with hot flashes because you're already hot. And then, you know, you've got and the other thing, we don't actually know exactly what causes hot flashes, but the research sort of points to the massive restructuring and rewiring that's going on in the brain during perimenopause. And they think that the temperature sensor in the brain sort of becomes, Lara Briden, she refers to it as being like a touchy thermostat, which means that the margin for acceptable temperature becomes very, very narrow. And so when you experience a very slight temperature shift, like drinking a hot drink or going from air conditioning outside into the heat or vice versa, the brain is like, whoa, something crazy just happened. And it starts to try and thermoregulate either by shivering or sweating. And so certainly when you live in an extreme climate, that can contribute to exacerbating some of these symptoms around what we call the vasomotor symptoms, the hot flashing, and some women get chills as well. So they'll have a hot flash and then afterwards they'll start shivering and shaking and feel very cold.
How interesting. When you usually address this with your clients or even like on social media, you're very big on talking about these practical ways of handling hot flashes. What are some strategies that are helpful for women to manage these hot flashes?
I think we have to take a step back, I think, and talk about perimenopause in a broader sense to start with, which is this idea that women in their 40s effectively go through a second puberty or like a reverse puberty, you know. And it's interesting that when we have teenagers, we sit them down and we're like, so some things are going to start changing with your body. You know, you might notice that you're feeling different. You might notice changes to your body. And we prepare them for what's going to happen. And we also cut them some slack when they're moody or volatile, or because we know that they're undergoing a major shift, a major transformation. And yet the same thing happens to a woman in her 40s and nobody says shit about it. So the conversation is starting to open up now. And as I look at the dialogue playing out online, it seems to me that there's sort of two factions effectively. And you've got the people on the really pro-medical side of it who sort of, and I realize that it's a spectrum. You've got the two opposites, which I'm going to talk about, and then you've got everybody in the middle. And I like to think that I sit in the middle, that I'm balanced. But you've got the people on the medical faction who sort of say, well, you know, menopause is probably only occurring because modern medicine is keeping us alive longer. And in times gone by, we would have menstruated longer. We menstruated up until into our 50s, and then we would have died. So we didn't have to deal with all of this. So they see menopause as a byproduct of modern medicine. And as a consequence, if women's hormones are starting to decline, then we should just replace their hormones. We'll give them hormone therapy and it's going to be totally fine. However, there are some issues with that, which is that maybe in England, women were dying in their 50s, but certainly we have evidence that in other cultures, women were living well beyond their 50s and they were going into menopause. And so you have the evolutionary biology argument on the other side of the fence, which is that menopause is actually something that we evolved into because there are only two species that go through menopause. There's us and the whales. And when the researchers look at the whales, what they see is that for those whale pods where the matriarchal whales had a menopause, were no longer busy with reproduction, and they were able to focus on being a leader within that whale society, those pods did better and their offspring had better outcomes. And so the way evolution works is that was favored in gene transfer. And so we have developed this menopause because it's good for the human species. And I believe, looking at the available evidence, that I'm on that camp of it's actually something that we're designed to do. However, for whatever reason, whether it's that we're living in like a toxic environment, whether it's because we have a lot more stress, or whether it is that there is a bit of a design flaw going on in there somewhere, I'm not 100% sure, you do have a number of women who are really struggling with this transition. And so one of the biggest things that I would say that can help a woman at this time of her life is stress management, and recognizing that she needs to give herself a breather while this transformation occurs. But of course, the flaw in that is that the 40s is usually a really hectic time of a woman's life. She's working. She's probably reached a point in her career where she has a lot of responsibility at work. She's undoubtedly managing more around the home because we know the stats on that. She may have children. Some of them may be, depending on when she started having kids, you could have teenagers. That comes with a pretty healthy side serving of stress. Her parents are starting to get older and maybe needing more help, or maybe having failing health. And then you also have friends that start to have health issues, or you've got divorce that gets thrown into the mix, financial pressure. So it's a very stressful time. And so to say you need to manage your stress is easy said, but perhaps not as easily done. But I still believe that we have to try. And in terms of hot flushes, we know that if you feel stressed, you are more susceptible to hot flushes. So that would be the first thing that I would say, is to figure out a way to manage your stress. And that is not something that you do once. It's something that you need to put practices in place. And one of the best ones is exercise, and weightlifting in particular, because of the positive impact that weight-bearing exercise has on bone density, brain health, and insulin resistance, which are all things that women in their 40s and beyond need to become aware of. And I can throw back to you at some point for your take on the benefits of weightlifting across those three areas. But I would say having a regular exercise practice, weightlifting, walking, and yoga in that order is what I believe to be the most beneficial. And then there are other interventions that you can employ after that, including herbal interventions. So there are certain herbal formulas and preparations that a woman can try. And there is, of course, the option of hormone therapy. So I don't know where you want to go next with the discussion. I'll kick back to you for that.
That's okay. I am just sinking all of this in because you made such good points around, well, first of all, like let's bring it back to the hot flushes side of things. It literally baffles me, the fact that how advanced we are in life compared to what it was, many decades ago. As you mentioned, like some women weren't even experiencing the symptoms that women do experience these days because they didn't live that far, where now there's certain women who are living beyond 100 years. And it's just like, whoa, what's happening here? So it's like, no wonder certain people are experiencing these symptoms, because this is probably still new to us, even though you've been around this realm for, decades, understanding around like the medicine side of things, but also the hormonal side of things. However, you also made a really good point around the hot flushes is also a symptom from the stress that we're experiencing as well. And as you mentioned, the stress is not something that you can just, pick up and leave. It's something that we have to manage, whether it's daily or weekly basis, and how it looks different. And I absolutely admire that, because too often people are spitting bullshit out there going, just manage your stress, don't stress, just be positive, smile more. It's just like, What, like, come on, like, let's give us a break. We're literally trying our best here. And it's bringing it back to how can you manage it at your best capacity? And as you mentioned, it's resistance training. I think it's something that a lot of people don't consider it enough, or they look at it as something that's too much, or they don't have the time for it, or they're too busy. And it's just like, that is the most common reason people are not going to do it, but this is why they need it the most. And you listed all the benefits. So it's just like, if you're not wanting to feel good about yourself, then don't train.
Oh, 100%. And 100%. There are no downsides to lifting weights. And you have, as we mentioned before, bone density, it's neuroprotective. It helps combat insulin resistance. It also helps to kind of lift a flagging sex drive thanks to the testosterone spike that you get afterwards. And a lot of women in this 40 plus group, they say that they just have absolutely no desire or interest in sex. And to me, I find that really interesting because there is some research that shows that your hormones, everyone's like, oh, it's the hormones, it's the hormones. And it's like, well, it might be, but it's probably more likely to be your lifestyle and the fact that you're not feeling like engaging in sex for a number of reasons, overwhelm being one of them. Then there's also this idea that we have two types of desire: responsive desire and spontaneous desire, and they are as they sound. So spontaneous desire, not surprisingly, it's more common for men than it is women, and that's where you're just like, I feel horny. And then you go looking to have sex. Responsive desire is more common in women. And that's not to say, of course, that there's not exceptions, but it's more common in women. And that means that if you're waiting to feel like having sex, you're never going to have sex, because you have responsive desire, meaning you have to first engage in something that your brain considers to be sexy. And then it sparks your desire, and then you want to have sex. And that's why we say we encourage women in that 40 plus bracket who will say, I just have no desire in sex, and it's really, I love my husband and I know he still wants it and he doesn't pressure me. Or sometimes I'm hearing from women that their husband is getting a bit pissy about it, and it's becoming, it's becoming a point of contention in the relationship. And we say to them, just schedule it in. Like, we'll start with once a week. Like, Wednesday is sex day, hump day in both senses of the word. And they're like, oh, please, shouldn't it be more spontaneous than that? And it's like, no, actually, you need to make the time, make the space, do a bit of self-care that day. This comes back to managing stress, managing your environment. If you know that that it's like date night, sex night, have a bath, go for a walk, put some makeup on, do whatever floats your boat. And that kind of leads you into this space, energetic space, where you're more open to it. And then you're like, okay, we'll start kissing now. And before you know it, a lot of women are like, oh, well, once I get into it, then it's really good. It's like, yeah, that's responsive desire. So weight training is really beneficial for helping with that side of women in their 40s as well, that kind of reduced sex drive, because it can help make you feel good about yourself. Because damn, you feel yourself when you're training. And also it does provide that testosterone spike post-workout. Don't skip leg day.
Not leg day and upper body day. They're both very, very important. And I love the fact how it all like correlates together as you're connecting the dots. If you're feeling stress, well, guess what? Resistance training is going to help. Feeling stress, having a better understanding of where the stress is coming from and how to manage it. And something that you mentioned around sex and libido is too often women who are very well stressed don't have that drive to want it. And it's really cool that you showed the two different perspectives of how as humans we interact with intimacy. But I also want you to explain to our listeners the connection between stress and its negative impact on sex drive for women.
Well, it's probably most easily explained in terms of the nervous system response. And I would recommend that if this is an area where some of your listeners may be more interested in more information, I can really recommend the book Come As You Are by, I want to say, Emily Nagoski. I'm sure you'll pop it in the show notes. She has a PhD in this, in sex education, and she's a fabulous resource. But the nervous system, you have two branches of your nervous system, the sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system, which everybody, I think, knows about by now. We know that the sympathetic is fight, flight, freeze. That's the one that we're in when we're stressed out. And the parasympathetic is rest and digest. And if you're constantly in fight or flight or freeze, first of all, you're not going to be producing enough of the hormones that you need in order to want to engage in sexual activity. And you're also not going to feel like it because your body's worried that it's about to be eaten by a saber-toothed tiger. So your body's a primitive, is primitive, and it doesn't know the difference between a jerk boss or a saber-toothed tiger coming to eat you. It just knows that it's stressed out. And so if you're constantly in fight or flight and you don't have the flexibility within your nervous system to move between those states, then it will blunt your ability to respond and to have a libido. I'm remembering from the book that I just recommended that she talks about sex drive kind of being a bit of a misnomer, a bit of a myth. But there's the other thing that she talks about, which is very interesting, is this idea of accelerator and brakes when it comes to sexual desire and arousal. And some people can have just naturally more sensitive accelerators and more sensitive brakes, or you might have a less sensitive accelerator and a very sensitive brake, meaning you're hard to turn on and pretty easy to turn off, versus someone who has really sensitive accelerator and less sensitive brakes, which is you just turned on really easily, and there's very few things that are going to take your mind off sex. When you want it, you want it. And so when we look at what in our life is contributing to the accelerator and the brakes, you have things like weight training or training in general, or exercise in general, because it produces endorphins, it leaves you feeling good about yourself. These are all things that press the accelerator because you feel good and happy in yourself. Maybe you take a dance class and that helps kind of liberate your inner vixen. Maybe you buy sexy lingerie, maybe you wear red lipstick, whatever it is that is contributing. Maybe you get a back rub from your partner and that kind of kicks off, that's pressing on the accelerator. Maybe you like when someone nibbles on your neck, that's pressing the accelerator. But then from upstairs you hear, "Mom," bam, instant break, right? Because as a mother, often the minute we hear a kid, we're like, all over Red Rover, we're done. Or it could be that you asked your partner 10 times to hang that picture on the wall. So he's over here nibbling your neck, or someone is over here nibbling your neck, but you ask them to do something for you that you've been nagging them about, and every time you walk past it, you can see it and it's pissing you off. He can nibble your neck till the cows come home because the brakes are being hit by the fact that he hasn't acknowledged, particularly if I talk about the love language as well. So if your love language is acts of service, that picture is not up on that wall. Ask me how I know. That picture is not up on that wall, then the brakes are just getting stomped. And so you have mitigating stress is important from a physiological point of view, in that you need to be in a more parasympathetic nervous system state in order to experience arousal and orgasm and all the good things. And then there's also these constructs that sit on top of that about managing the stress in your life in terms of the accelerator and the brake model.
It's so I love the fact that you brought in these analogies, because too often people talk about the scientific side of things, which we did. You started off by explaining the two different types of nervous system and why the stress occurs and how we can, manage it a little bit better. But the scenarios of real life, like, as you mentioned, like the acts of service, if someone's not doing something that you perceive as love, of course you're not going to be in the mood. Of course you're going to be aggravated. So it just makes so much sense. And it also comes down to having that open conversation, which I feel as though, again, it could be like this taboo thing. And I'm hoping, by us talking more about this, it's just going to break the chains by women being more open, by expressing that they don't have this sex desire due to X, Y, and Z, or having more open conversations with their partners on what they're wanting and needing, instead of building up that resentment, building up that stress and then anxiety. Because we know once we're all too much in our head, it just goes downhill from there. And sometimes most women either burn out, they get sick, they're tired. It's just like a whole kerfuffle. And the book that you mentioned is so good, Come As You Are. And one of the books I absolutely love is Vagina by Naomi Wolf. Now, her book, I don't know if you've read it, Joanna, but it's such a cool, cutting edge book that is very diverse into like the cultural history of exploring the role of female desire and how it affects our identity. And it's a really easy read for those, who find books a little bit, uneasy to read. I don't know where I was going that, but you can also listen to it on Audible as well. Speaking of, where was I going with that? With anxiety. That's where I was going, because we know already like stress is impacting the sex drive, it's impacting our hormones, but also something that too often women experience when they head into their 40s. You mentioned there was like a lot about brain fog and anxiety. What are some specific lifestyle changes or coping mechanism that can effectively, help women address these symptoms?
So anxiety is a really interesting one, because you asked me actually in terms of my personal experience before, and I said, look, I'm not in perimenopause, but I reckon I'm knocking on the door. So I've had 6 months of irregular periods, which for me is like, whoa, that's weird. I'm normally, I don't normally say this because I'm aware that it might make people want to put my face underwater, but normally I cycle with the moon, right? So I ovulate at full moon, I bleed at new moon, I have basically a pain-free period, right? I get a little bit on a scale of 1 to 10, it's maybe a 2 out of 10 for an hour on day 1. And I have a pretty light flow. I don't tend to bleed overnight overly much. Like it just doesn't appear in the nighttime because I'm lying down. And it's gone in 4 days, so it's really, it just kind of comes and goes. But lately that is starting to shift, and it could be perimenopause. It could also be a little bit of a thyroid thing. It could be a change in my diet. I recently found out I can't eat oxalate, which is most of the food that I was eating. So I've recently changed my diet pretty dramatically as well. So there could be other things that are contributing to it. But I did have a panic attack when I was in Cancun in February this year. And I don't have a history of anxiety I have, the social anxiety that we all have, anxiety before speaking on stage or any of those kind of things. But in terms of panic attacks and anxiety, it's not something that I have really dealt with. And I blame the rum. Because I can't drink dark rum. It's never agreed with me, but I really like it because I wish I'd been a pirate. And so when you're on the Mexican Caribbean, there's not a lot of drinks that don't have dark rum in them. And I ordered this one that was delicious. But later on in the hotel room, I've woken up in the middle of the night. I've got my 2 kids in a double bed next to me. I'm in bed with my partner. And all of a sudden, I'm like, what is happening? And I knew it was a panic attack because I've had one other panic attack in my life, and it was when I was dealing with recurrent UTIs, that's what got me into this work. When you did the intro and you're like, she knows what it's like. It was 5 years or so of dealing with recurrent UTIs. And whilst I had a bit of a complex picture, there was a hormonal component during some of that time as one of the drivers. Turns out I said I can't eat oxalates. That's what was kind of loading the gun was my diet. And then I had stacked on top of that, there was a microbial issue and then possibly a hormonal issue as well. So with health, with anything that's chronic, that's been going for a long time, you really are peeling back those layers of the onion. It's very rarely one thing, by the time you're dealing with something for that length of time. And I remember the first time I had a panic attack, I woke up and I was like, what is happening? I thought I was dying. And then what saved me in that moment was, I was like, I think I might be having a panic attack. And I got really excited because I'd only ever heard about it secondhand from patients. And there is nothing like a firsthand experience to make you a more empathetic practitioner. And so I was like, oh, my heart feels like it might be about to explode. And I was like, oh, I'm getting cold sweats. That's fascinating. And so what I actually did in that moment was step one of managing anxiety or a panic attack, and that is to disassociate. They say you need to see it, don't be it. So in that moment, I wasn't, oh my God, I'm panicking. Oh my God, I'm freaking out. What's happening? I took a step outside of myself and observed. And I was like, wow, that's interesting. My heart's racing. Or that's interesting. I have these racing thoughts, and observe what was going on for me without becoming it. So that wasn't a conscious thing. That was just because I was so curious about what was happening. But that was the first thing that I would recommend to people who are dealing with anxiety is, if you can see it, don't be it. Don't step into it and embody the panic attack. Observe that your body is demonstrating the signs of someone who's having a panic attack. And then the next thing that I was able to do, because I have a lifetime of practice under my belt, was I used a breathing technique that I teach to literally anyone who will listen, which is called 4-7-8 breathing. And like most breathing techniques, it's just adapted from yoga, from a yogic breathing technique. But they teach it to special forces ops so that they can use it when they're in high stress situations. And it's very easy to do. You breathe in for a count of 4, hold for a count of 7, and then you exhale audibly. You constrict the back of your throat a little bit. You make that like Darth Vader sound. You'll go, and you do that for a count of 8. And you do it as a cycle. And it is so effective, so effective. And so I was able to do the deep breathing and kind of breathe through it. But I was only able to implement that at that moment because I have practiced it hundreds of times before. And so the thing I want to say about anxiety in that sort of 40-year-old, 40+ age range is it can come out of nowhere. Don't think that because you don't have a history of anxiety that's not going to be one of your symptoms. Because I talk to women who are like, I'm too terrified to drive on the motorway, like the highway. This driving's never bothered them before, but they're absolutely crippled by the thought of driving on the motorway. And so you need to have techniques and tips in your toolkit that you've already practiced that you can bring out when you need them. Because in the middle of a panic attack, you don't want to be trying to master a breathing technique. So they're probably the two biggest ones I would say for the acute moment is see it, don't be it. And then use a breathing technique like 4-7-8. If you're new to breathing techniques, you can use what I call 4-4-4+, which is you breathe in for 4, hold for 4, and then exhale for 4 or more. Because it's that long exhale that's actually activating the parasympathetic nervous system, which is what we were talking about before. And then, of course, being aware of other things that might trigger you. Some people find that in their 40s, they just can't drink caffeine and alcohol. It just, they don't want to be that person, but it just does not serve them. And of course, exercise and sleep is another one that's really, really important. But of course, again, that can be a bit of a self-fulfilling prophecy because one of the symptoms of perimenopause is disrupted sleep and insomnia.
I love the fact that you brought up the breathing side of things because a couple of years ago, I had a panic attack from an anxiety experience. And I remember in the moment, if I didn't know about breathing techniques or meditation or whatever the practices that I was doing, I probably would have, the situation probably would have been worse than what it was. So again, like having these tools in your box are so useful. And, like you said, Joanna, is if you're not familiar with it, it's just like, cool, like looking into it a little bit more and seeing what helps you to relax in that moment. Yes, the breathing is one big compartment of it, but maybe it's like talking to a friend, maybe it's writing it down or whatever it's going to help to bring you back to, homeostasis instead of staying in that anxiety side of things. Speaking of anxiety, too often when I speak to my clients who are, moving towards into their 40s or even like mid 40s, is this social expectation of having to look a certain way or behave a certain way, or these things that they're having to face where, again, I don't know if it's like the beauty standards these days that aging is is not beautiful, and, you know, constantly having this idea that you have to be youthful as long as possible. And I think it really deceives the purpose of us growing older and embracing the change. And I have way too many conversations with women going, I wish I was 25 again. And I always ask them, like, why? Like, why 25? Oh, because, you know, I had the tight body. I didn't have, you know, the loose skin. I don't have the gray hairs. And I'm like, well, this is your way of being able to embrace these changes. Because again, I could turn around and be like, I wish I was this, I look the same as what I did when I was 20, but I don't, because I was fucking miserable when I was 20. I was too skinny. I had eating disorders. I hated my body. It's just like, now I'm fully embracing these changes. And yeah, at 35, I'm noticing these changes. You know, I'm starting to get the grays. I'm starting to notice like these little cute wrinkles, and like whatever comes up, it's just like, where I'm trying to go with this is, how can we ease these expectations on women not to be so pressurized by looking this way, but having more support and understanding that this is completely normal to have these health changes along the way.
Yeah, I have to speaking of deep breathing, I always have to take a deep breath before I talk about this topic, because I get very passionate about it and I can get shrill. So I think that reframing is really, really important. And it's so funny that I hear it as well. People are like, oh, it sucks to be a woman. And I tend not to try and negate someone's lived experience when I'm having these conversations. But in this one chat, I said to this woman, how can you say that? You know, like, if you believe in anything spiritual, you are a conduit. Your body is a conduit to heaven, right? A soul passes from the spirit realm into your body. You house that being. You hold that soul and grow it a body with it, you know, in cooperation with it, because it has its own vital force. But the two of you work together to grow a body. And then the portal opens again through your body, and you birth that soul and that being into this world. And no man will ever know what that's like to do. And even if a woman can't have a baby or chooses not to have a baby, you still have that potential inside you. You are still a conduit to heaven or the other side, or the universe, or however you understand that aspect of your spirituality. And if you're not a spiritual person, your body has the ability to take someone else's DNA, right? Allow it to mix in your body, the two DNAs mix. When at the moment of conception, when the sperm hits the egg, the sperm has something on its head, a jaunty little cap called the acrosome. And the acrosome has a bunch of enzymes in it that is able to pierce the membrane, the outer membrane of the ovum of the egg. And that's how this is in infertility. One of the issues that we see with sperm is that they don't have this acrosome. So they're like knocking on the door, like, let me in. but they don't have the enzymes that are required to actually penetrate. And at the point where the acrosome penetrates the exterior wall of the ovum, we see a spark. You can see it on a microscope. It's called the acrosomal spark, the spark of life. And so purely from a biological perspective, your body becomes a place where these two DNAs intertwine and create a whole new being. And you house that being, you birth that being, and then you support that being from your body until it's able to go on, and it will be a completely unique being, just as you are a completely unique being in this world. How can you say being a woman is shit? To me, I think that's an incredible thing. And then it's that, you know, men, I'm not a man, so I don't understand a male's journey in this world in the same way. I'd love to hear a male perspective on what it means to be a man. But to say that being a woman is just shit and horrible and men don't understand and it's not fair, that stresses me out. And then I also think that we have been sold this bullshit that the best time of a woman's life is that 25, perky tits, you know, bouncy, energetic, tight body, as you say, that's her at her peak attractiveness, because you could not pay me to go back and be 25 again. Right. I didn't have the confidence that I have now. I didn't know shit about life. I knew more than most people because of my life experience, but I didn't know I've mellowed so much. I've become so much more empathetic, you know, and these are qualities that I've had my children. And if you want a spiritual teacher, have a baby. So I would not trade where I'm at 42 for anything to go back and be 25 again. But we have been convinced that this is when we are at our most attractive and valuable. And those who believe that we have, you know, these patriarchal influences working against us will say it is to keep us from our power. Because there's a First Nations American saying, which I'll need a minute to think about. It is, at puberty, a woman enters her power. During menses, she learns about her power. And at menopause, she becomes her power. I've paraphrased. But the important part of that saying is that menopause, she becomes her power. And so we have, in Chinese medicine, we call menopause the second spring. So we see it as a time for you to blossom a second time. And it's because the hormone, estrogen is known as the hormone of not service and sacrifice. That's what I paraphrase a lot. That's what I paraphrased to you last time. It is appeasement, the hormone of appeasement. Estrogen is what keeps you keeping the peace. It's what leaves you being like, oh, well, you know, well, it's better for the kids, or, okay, well, I'm a bit annoyed by what my husband said, but I'll just get on and do it because I don't want to make a fuss. And the estrogen is what allows you to do that. And as estrogen starts to fall away, we don't take shit anymore. And it also, those hormones of reproduction, they do bind us to family. They do bind us to caring for other people and putting other people's needs before our own. And the reason that they do is because being part of a family unit is important for our species. It is richly rewarding to have children and to care for them. So there is a time for that. But then as your children, and this talks more to that evolution point of view, as your children move away from you and these hormones start to fall away, it's a chance for you to return back to yourself and to step into that final third of your life with all of the wisdom that you gained in the first two. The first one being girl, the second being woman, and the third being wise woman. And so I think there is a backlash. You know, we're seeing Pamela Anderson going to the fashion show without a lick of makeup on. There are other women who are coming forward. They're letting their hair grey out. They're saying enough. Women get older too, and it should not be a big deal. So I think we're getting more role models, which is excellent. And I think it's about changing the perspective and having a bit of a shift in the narrative about what it means to be a woman at midlife and beyond.
I'm not sure why this is struck in my head, but it brings me back to the fear of failure and fear of success. And like, stick with me on this. So too often we'll have this fear of failing by doing a certain thing, whether it's like strength training or, you know, changing a body composition whatsoever. But then we have this fear of success, of actually achieving that goal. So this goes back to societal pressure by us fearing the changes that we're experiencing. But then once you actually experience that change and you're successfully embracing yourself, that's where the challenge comes in, because too often we're starting to embrace ourselves, but we're noticing the changes around our environment, or the people we hang out with are no longer our friends because they're doing things that you don't value. And then that can be quite tough, especially it can be on women and men as well. It's like pursuing a new way of living and being that some people cannot relate or do not want to relate to it. So this is why I feel as though the beauty standards and these certain expectations, people are jumping in on it. They're continuing in with that realm because they're seeing everyone do it. But then you're wanting to do the absolute complete different thing, but you're fearing of actually doing that because you don't know if there's someone else out there who's going to think the same way as you. However, as you mentioned, there are these role models now who are, not dyeing their hair. They're letting the gray come through. They're letting, having makeup-free days. They're not really worrying about the fact of what society is trying to tell them how to be and how to do, which is empowering more women to actually embrace what they are and still working towards what they're wanting to be.
I think it also depends on what makes you happy and your motivation for doing things. So I'm a big kind of fan of live and let live. So if someone doesn't like the grey hair and they want to dye it, then that's up to them. But then when they come to me and they say, my hair's falling out, it's breaking off, it's really thin, you have to give me something to get my hair to grow back. And I say to them, I can, but we will be pushing shit uphill if you keep dyeing your hair.
Yeah.
Right? You're using, and so it depends. To me, that's a bit of an ethics thing. I tend to be very, very direct, probably too direct, but that's all right. The people that come and work with me appreciate that. But I feel like it's unethical to say to someone, oh, sure, take biotin or take zinc or take silica, if you don't point out to them that what you are doing is directly working against you. I've gone off on a little bit of a tangent there, but do what makes you happy as long as it's serving you, I think is the point of what I was saying there, that you can dye your hair. Use henna. It's more natural. If you like wearing makeup, wear makeup, but just wear one that doesn't fuck with your hormones,
Yeah.
And the other thing about body image and changing body shape, I guess that's a massive topic, right? We could do a whole podcast just on that topic. But what I've seen for be successful, where I've seen women be successful in accepting and loving their body, is when they start to look at their body in terms of what it can do and not how it looks. And I think that's a really critical shift that someone can make in order to try and feel a bit better about themselves, is to realize that your body is, I guess this is a segue too into spirituality. Your body is the vehicle for your soul. And so do you have a spiritual dimension to your life? In my work, that's one of the areas that we look at is you have to address yourself from a physical, emotional, and spiritual perspective. And that doesn't mean necessarily believing in a God, but it is believing in your spirit, in your own spirit. And maybe you're just here for that one time. You don't believe in an afterlife, you don't believe in reincarnation, you're just here this one time. To me, I'm like, almost that's the one that's brave to believe in, because that means you've only got one shot, right? Like, if you fuck this one up, you don't get to come back and fix it. If you believe in reincarnation, you get to come back and have another shot. But if you don't believe in a God or a heaven or an afterlife or any of that, this is your one shot. So why are you here? And if you're busy worrying that your titties are a little saggier than they used to be and you've got some cellulite and you've got a grey hair, fuck, are you not wasting your time while you're here? Like, that seems to be a waste of time to me, because clock is ticking.
Amen to that. And again, like, we're all going to go through those days and moments where you look at yourself in the mirror and you're not pleased by what you're seeing. But again, it's just a passing moment. Like, this is something that I teach my clients all the time. It's like, what you're experiencing now is a habit and a routine that you've been doing for so many years. So for you to break it is going to take a while, but eventually you're going to come to that place of self-acceptance and giving yourself a little bit of compassion, knowing, cool, these changes are happening, but you can also embrace other ways of living and doing. Joanna, thank you so much for joining me today. This conversation has brought a lot of insight, and I know a lot of our listeners are going to be like, whoa, I need to put all of these practical practices in place. But before we head off, where can our listeners find you?
So I am online. I'm on Instagram, and I've learned after doing lots of podcasts now that I don't have to spell out my name, that you can put it in the show notes. So I'll get you to drop my Instagram in the show notes. People can come be my friend on Facebook. I've got a website they can check out. You can become part of my email newsletter. I send out a newsletter once a week. And I also have a little thing that I put together for listeners of this podcast, if they want, which covers some of the themes that you and I went through today. And also when I talk to women at midlife, at this time of their life, the three things that come up the most are hot flushes, weight gain, and brain fog as the three big ones. They are by no means the only three, but they're the ones that I hear most often. And so I have a little handbook that I've put together that gives you my top recommendations for each of those areas from a lifestyle point of view, and also some supplements that people can try. They obviously need to check with someone to make sure they don't have any contraindications, and what to do if supplements and lifestyle are not enough. There is a tertiary level of help that is available, and I don't want any women to think they just have to suffer in silence. There is help available to help ease your journey through that transition. And so I'll get you to put a link to that document in the show notes as well.
Will do. Well, girls, if you enjoyed today's podcast, please make sure that you tag Joanna. And then till next time, let's start working to utilizing more of our bodies instead of working against them.
Amen to that.